I'm Dr. Judy Melinek. I'm a board-certified forensic pathologist, and I just watched the Nolan Wells press conference, and I wanted to share some context for everyone. Being able to definitively state the cause of death after a body has not been found for several days and has been subsequently autopsied twice with signs of decomposition is incredibly unlikely. Drowning is what's called a diagnosis of exclusion, which means that when you've got a fresh body, you want to be able to look at the body and see if there's any other causes of death for that body that is found in water that exclude the death being exclusively a drowning. So for example, if someone is shot and then thrown in the water, you'll have that gunshot and they'll be bleeding and the gunshot will be the cause of death, and the thrown in the water is not the cause of death. It's not even on the death certificate. If a person is strangled and they die from strangulation and then their dead body is thrown in the water, their body will take on water, but the cause of death is going to be strangulation, not drowning. Also for any kind of traumatic injuries. Now we got to talk about natural death for a second. If someone has a heart attack while they are swimming, and because they're having the heart attack as they're exercising in the water and they take on water and they drown, the cause of death is actually drowning, and the heart attack is listed on the death certificate under other significant conditions contributing to death. So even though the heart attack might have killed them on dry land, it might not have. Most certainly they wouldn't have drowned on dry land. So we defer to the hostile environment, which is the water, to call it a drowning. Now, identifying natural disease and identifying trauma is relatively easy in a fresh body. It can be very difficult in a decomposed body. His body was found 2 days after he disappeared, and this second autopsy done by Dr. Roger Mitchell wasn't until 4 days later. So we're dealing with quite a bit of decomposition, even if the body was refrigerated during that time. And then we have this other issue of the fact that not all the results are back. The toxicology would have been done on the fluids from the body from the first autopsy. From the second autopsy, you're going to have a lot higher alcohol levels from the decomposition caused by bacteria, not caused by drinking. So again, it's the fluid and blood from the first autopsy that really matter. And the other thing you have to consider, and there's one other important piece of information from that press conference, which is that the neck block, the portion of the neck from the front end, was missing. So Dr. Mitchell did not have a chance to examine that part of Nolan Wells' anatomy. Why is that important? Because if somebody is strangled, especially manual strangulation, the injuries are going to be to the front of the neck. There may be some redness at the back of the neck as well if, injury comes from behind, but generally this part of the neck doesn't have the major blood vessels and the airway. It's the front of the neck that does. So compression or damage to the front of the airway, that's going to be found in the neck block that is still sitting at the medical examiner's office, that was not released with the body. So you may ask, is this common practice for pathologists to keep a portion of the anatomy with them at the medical examiner's office and not release it to the family? And the answer is yes. We will sometimes retain important specimens that have pathology in a jar under formaldehyde at the medical examiner's office for further examination or as evidence. And the absence of that neck block is really important because we still don't have information from the first autopsy that has not been released yet. So we don't know if it was kept out of an abundance of caution, meaning that it didn't have any findings and it was negative, or it was kept because it has findings, because there's a broken hyoid bone, or because there's hemorrhage in the strap muscles. Until we get that first autopsy report, we don't know why it's been retained. So why should anybody do a second autopsy? A second autopsy is often done in cases where there is a high-profile case such as this, or there is concern from the family for foul play, and they're just not getting answers from the medical examiner's office because the medical examiner's office is still doing their investigation and is keeping things under wraps, because if there is foul play, they have the evidence, they have the physical evidence that might be able to trap the killer, and they don't want to release that to the public. Even if there is no evidence of foul play, just the lack of evidence is evidence and is important information that might affect how people are interrogated, whether they're going to tell the truth or not the truth about what happened to him. You have to understand that the medical examiner's autopsy is legally mandated, and it is ultimately the most independent autopsy because it's not beholden to the family, it's not beholden to the prosecutor, to the police, to anybody else. It's an independent agency. So that is an independent autopsy, but it takes time. And it takes time until we get all the information back, including the toxicology report. And to answer the question, if somebody's intoxicated and they drown as a result of their intoxication, meaning that they're just, too intoxicated to be able to swim adequately, the cause of death would still be a drowning, but the intoxication would be considered a significant contributing condition. But because of what I said about alcohol forming from bacteria after death, if the body is decomposed, you have to subtract some of that alcohol because it may have been caused by bacteria and may not have been a sign of intoxication. And you can have up to 0.20 gram percent. So 0.08 is above the legal limit in most states for driving, but you can get up to 0.20 in a massively decomposed body. So it really throws you off when you have decomposition and alcohol to try to figure out whether there was alcohol on board or whether all of it's just been made by bacteria. So I hope this answers some questions about what I saw in the press conference, what other people saw as well. I will go through the autopsy, or at least the report that's been released, with a fine-tooth comb, but this is just my first impressions based on watching the press report. As always, if you have any questions, put them in the comments. I'll see if I can answer them. And we really need to wait for the medical examiner's report to find out what really was found at the autopsy when the body was fresh. I think that's going to clarify a lot of things.
There's a jar sitting in a medical examiner's office in Mississippi right now. Inside it, preserved in formaldehyde, is a piece of an 18-year-old boy's throat. It has been there since July. It has never been shown to his family. It has never been shown to the independent pathologist his parents paid to examine him. And according to a board-certified forensic pathologist who has spent her career testifying in courtrooms about exactly this kind of tissue, that missing piece of anatomy is the only thing standing between he drowned and someone strangled him and put him in the water. Tonight, we're not going to tell you Nolan Wells was murdered. We're not going to tell you he wasn't. We're going to show you why the woman whose entire career is built on answering that exact question says nobody currently alive outside a lock state office actually knows. If you want the version of this case built on documents instead of guesses, subscribe now, because what we're about to walk through changes the way you'll hear every future update in this story.
New at 5, today the legal team representing the family of Nolan Wells shared an update on the investigation. This was at the National Urban League's conference in Nashville. Attorney Eric Hurt says the legal team continues to work with the Jackson County District Attorney's Office. He says DA Angel Myers-McElrath is willing to listen to some of the evidence their team has gathered, although he says they are still allegedly waiting on her office to give back some evidence. Previously, Crump announced that his team and the DA's office agreed to a mutual inspection of Wells's cell phone.
The phones, not just our clients' phones, but the other phones that are involved in this situation, we are trying to coordinate and have come to a tentative agreement with the district attorney to go ahead and have them investigated together jointly with our experts as well as their experts. And I believe, if I'm not speaking out of turn, the FBI is going to also be present there. And that's going to show a lot of stuff that we haven't seen.
Crump's team did not clarify whose phone, besides Wells, they wanted to investigate, nor did they say when that joint inspection might take place.
Before Nolan Wells was a name attached to a hashtag, a press conference, or a piece of retained tissue in a jar. He was a person, and if we don't start there, we've already failed him. Nolan Xavier Wells grew up on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, in and around Ocean Springs, a town of shrimp boats and moss-draped oaks, and a coastline that has raised generations of kids who grew up on the water the way other kids grow up on a soccer field. He graduated from Ocean Springs High School. He played football, a wide receiver, the kind of position that rewards speed and instinct and the willingness to go up for a ball you're not sure you'll come down with safely. By the summer of 2026, he moved on to Southwest Mississippi Community College, recruited to keep playing the game he loved, with a future in front of him that had shape and direction. Friends and family describe him consistently, not as a saint, not as a caricature, but as a specific kind of young man, big-hearted, socially easy, the type who never met a stranger, the kind of 18-year-old who takes photos and videos at every gathering, because he wants to remember the good moments, not because he's performing for anyone. His mother, Christine Wansley, would later tell reporters that the night before he left for the holiday weekend that would become the last of his life, he cooked her salmon for dinner. He hugged her. He told her he loved her. He left to spend the night with friends ahead of the 4th of July. That is the last ordinary memory she has of her son, and no amount of grand juries, autopsies, or viral audio clips will ever give her back the version of that night, where he simply came home. That is who Nolan Wells was before any of what follows. Hold on to that, because everything else in this story, the tissue in the jar, the disputed audio, the timeline arguments, only matters because it happened to him. Ocean Springs is a small town, the kind of place where a football roster and a graduating class overlap enough that half the community can tell you a story about a kid like Nolan without needing to look anything up. Coaches remember him. Classmates remember him. The people who watched him grow up on that stretch of the Gulf Coast describe someone who was still, in the truest sense, becoming himself, still finding out what kind of man he wanted to be, still cataloging his life in photos and videos the way most 18-year-olds do, one gathering, one inside joke, one ordinary Tuesday at a time. He wasn't famous. He wasn't a public figure before any of this happened. He was somebody's son, somebody's teammate, somebody's friend, the guy who'd ask a friend's mother to take one more picture of him before bed just because he liked the way the night had gone. That detail, small as it sounds, matters more than it seems. It's the reason his mother later found it so strange that his Snapchat held nothing at all from that day, because taking pictures wasn't something Nolan did occasionally. It was something people who knew him could set their watch by. He had just finished his first year at Southwest Mississippi Community College, playing wide receiver, chasing a future that, as of the morning of July 4th, 2026, still had every possibility open to it. Recruiting trips ahead of him, a sophomore season ahead of him, an entire life ahead of him. None of that gets to happen now, and no forensic report, however precise, however honest, will ever change that fact. But an honest report, delivered without shortcuts, is the very least his family has earned in exchange for everything they've already lost. On July 4th, 2026, Nolan traveled out to Horn Island, a barrier island roughly 10 miles off the Mississippi coast, reachable only by private boat, part of the Gulf Islands National Seashore. No buildings, no cell towers worth mentioning, just sand, surf, and on a holiday weekend, boat after boat of coastal families and teenagers soaking up the sun. He went with a group of friends. He was last confirmed seen around 3 o'clock that afternoon in blue swim trunks and sunglasses, talking with a young woman named Katie, who he'd apparently just met that day. According to the accounts given by his friends, sometime after 3, the boat they'd all come out on developed serious mechanical trouble, a failing bilge pump that had it taking on water. The group made the decision to head back to the mainland rather than risk staying stranded. Nolan, according to those same friends, chose to stay behind, planning to catch a different ride back later, possibly after spending more time with Katie. He never got that ride. His friends made it home. He did not. His mother reported him missing that night, after a friend of Nolan's had already contacted the Coast Guard around 11 p.m. A search involving the Sheriff's Office, the Coast Guard, the National Park Service, and volunteer groups like the United Cajun Navy launched the next day, boats fanning out across open water, drones scanning the shoreline, volunteers walking sections of an island most of them had never set foot on before, all of it happening under a Mississippi summer sun with the specific hope that drives every search like this one, that the person being searched for is still out there, still alive, still findable. For 2 full days, that hope was the only thing anyone involved in that search had to hold on to. On July 6th, 2 days after he was last seen, a National Park Service ranger found his body in the water off the island's northwestern tip, the same general stretch of shoreline where he'd last been seen alive. He was identified not through a visual identification by his family, not through a simple confirmation, but through dental records. That detail alone tells you something about the condition his body was in by the time it was recovered. And it matters more than most people realize once we get into the forensic side of the story. Within hours of that recovery, before a single formal autopsy had been performed, Jackson County Sheriff John Ledbetter told reporters there was no reason to believe a crime had occurred. That sentence, delivered before any pathologist had even opened Nolan's body, is where a significant part of this controversy begins. And it's worth sitting with exactly how unusual that sequence is, because most people watching this assume a sheriff's public statement reflects a scientific conclusion. In this case, it didn't. It couldn't have. The science hadn't happened yet. Since that first statement, a slow, piece-by-piece stream of records requests has filled in more that afternoon. And it's worth walking through what those records actually show, because the timeline itself carries weight independent of any single disputed detail. GPS data obtained from the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources shows the boat Nolan had traveled out on left its dock at approximately 9:56 that morning and arrived at Horn Island at 11:14. According to that same data, the boat left the island at 4:31 that afternoon, roughly 90 minutes after Nolan was last confirmed seen. It returned to its original departure dock, then traveled into a nearby bayou before returning to the dock again, and later that evening was moved by trailer over land to the boat owner's residence. Audio obtained separately through a public records request captures a call made to a private towing service that afternoon. A young man's voice reporting that the boat was taking on water because of a failed bilge pump and confirming, when asked, that everyone was accounted for on board. None of that data, on its own, tells us where Nolan was or what happened to him. What it does tell us is that there was real documented mechanical trouble that afternoon, a real reason for the group to leave when they did, and a real window of time, roughly the hour and change between when Nolan was last seen and when that boat eventually made it back to the mainland, during which nobody outside that boat has been able to independently confirm his exact location or condition. That window is not proof of anything sinister by itself. Boats break down. Groups get separated on crowded islands. But it is the exact shape of gap that keeps every unresolved question in this case alive, and it is worth understanding clearly before we go any further, because everything else we're about to cover sits inside that same gap. Here's your first strategic marker in this story, and I want you to actually type it, because it's going to matter again later, and I want to see how many of you are still with me when we come back to it. If you understand why an official can say no foul play before an autopsy exists, and you understand why that's a problem, type the word exclusion in the comments right now. We're going to come back to that exact word in a few minutes, and it is the single most important concept in this entire case. If you don't type it now, you'll have to scroll back up later to find it. So save yourself the trouble. Before we go further, a quick programming note. This channel exists because viewers keep outpacing subscribers on almost every case we cover, and Nolan's story deserves better than that gap. If you want to actually be part of this community, instead of a one-time visitor, hit subscribe now. It costs nothing. It takes 2 seconds, and it means you won't miss the moment this case finally gets an answer. Thank you, genuinely, for being here. Now, let's talk about what actually happened after Nolan's body came out of the water, because this is where the case stops being a tragedy on a beach and starts being a documented, at times contradictory, paper trail. The state of Mississippi performed the first autopsy. Nolan's family, through their attorney Ben Crump, arranged for a second independent autopsy conducted by Dr. Roger Mitchell, a board-certified forensic pathologist and the president of the National Medical Association, the oldest organization representing black physicians in the country. That second autopsy took place in Washington, D.C., days after Nolan's body was recovered, funded in part by former NFL quarterback Colin Kaepernick. 2 examinations, 2 separate rooms, 2 separate pathologists. And as of the most recent press conferences in this case, neither one has produced a conclusive, publicly released cause of death. Dr. Mitchell's findings, read aloud at a press conference alongside Nolan's parents, landed on one word: undetermined. That word gets misunderstood constantly online. So let's be precise about what it actually means, because precision is the entire point of this channel. Undetermined does not mean nothing happened to Nolan. It does not mean his death has been ruled an accident. It does not mean anyone has been cleared of anything. It means the evidence available to Dr. Mitchell at the time he examined Nolan's body was not sufficient to reach a firm conclusion in either direction. That's it. That's the whole meaning. It is a statement about the limits of the evidence, not a verdict on what occurred. And that brings us to the reason we're doing this video at all. A piece of tissue that was never on Dr. Mitchell's table. In his written report, Dr. Mitchell noted that certain internal structures from the front of Nolan's neck, what forensic pathologists refer to as a neck block, had been retained by the state medical examiner's office and were not sent along with the body for his independent examination. That is not a minor procedural footnote. It is, according to multiple independent forensic experts who reviewed this case publicly, the single biggest reason this case cannot currently be closed. This is where Dr. Judy Melinek comes in. Dr. Melinek is a board-certified forensic pathologist, the kind of expert who has spent an entire career standing in front of juries explaining exactly what a body can and cannot tell you. She has no connection to this investigation. She isn't working for the family. She isn't working for the state. She's not being paid by either legal team. She watched the same press conference the rest of the public watched, and she came away from it with a level of technical concern that most media coverage of this case has simply failed to translate for regular viewers. So we're going to translate it for you, slowly, carefully, and completely, because this is a part of the story that actually matters most, and it's the part almost nobody has explained properly. Here's the first thing Dr. Melinek wants you to understand, and it is a concept behind the word I asked you to type a few minutes ago. Drowning is what's called a diagnosis of exclusion. That means a pathologist cannot simply look at a body recovered from water and write drowning on the death certificate as a default explanation. Water conceals things. A person can drown, full stop, no other cause involved. Or a person can die from something else entirely, a heart attack, a blow to the head, manual strangulation, and then end up in the water afterward. Sometimes looking on a surface examination, almost identical to a straightforward drowning. Because of that overlap, a forensic pathologist has to work backward. They have to rule out every other plausible explanation, trauma, natural disease, drug toxicity, before they're allowed to land on drowning as the actual cause of death. It is not a first guess. It is the last conclusion left standing after everything else has been eliminated. Think about what that means for Jackson County Sheriff John Ledbetter's original statement that there was no reason to suspect foul play. That statement was made before any of the ruling out process had happened. It wasn't wrong because someone lied. It was premature because the entire diagnostic framework that pathologists like Dr. Melinek use requires you to look at everything else first, and nobody had looked at everything else yet. A statement like that, delivered to a room of reporters and broadcast across the country, carries enormous weight with the public regardless of whether the science behind it exists yet. Once the public hears no foul play, that framing follows a case everywhere it goes. It shapes how urgently people believe evidence needs to be pursued. It shapes what gets covered and what gets ignored. And once it's been said out loud on camera, it is extraordinarily difficult to walk back, even when the actual, structured evidence hasn't been generated yet. So why does the missing neck tissue matter so specifically? Let's break down exactly what a pathologist is looking for when they examine that part of the body, because Dr. Melinek was precise about this. And precision here is the difference between real understanding and empty speculation. There are 3 specific findings a forensic examiner looks for when manual strangulation is even a remote possibility. The first is the hyoid bone, a small, delicate, horseshoe-shaped bone that sits high in the front of the throat. Unlike most bones in the human body, the hyoid isn't protected by surrounding bones structured the way, say, your ribs protect your heart. It floats, essentially, suspended by muscle and ligament, which is exactly why it's so vulnerable to fracture under the kind of sustained pressure involved in strangulation. The second is the strap muscles, the thin bands of muscle running down the front of the neck. Under compression, tiny blood vessels inside those muscles can rupture internally, leaving hemorrhage-trained pathologists can identify even when there's nothing visible on the surface of the skin at all. The third is petechiae, the pinpoint hemorrhages that form when small blood vessels burst from sustained pressure on the neck, often showing up in the eyes, the face, or the lining of the heart itself. All three of those signs, every single one of them, live in the exact region that was retained by the state and never handed over for Dr. Mitchell's independent examination. Type the word neck block in the comments right now if you understand why this specific missing detail changes the entire shape of this case. I want to see that number, because if you're still watching at this point, you already understand more about this investigation than 90% of the coverage floating around online. Here's the trap at the center of this entire case, and Dr. Melinek said it plainly. Without the front of the neck, you cannot confirm strangulation, but you equally cannot rule it out. Read that twice, because it's not a loophole, and it's not spin from either side of this case. It is simply mechanically true. The evidence capable of answering the single most important open question in this investigation was never placed in front of the person trying to answer it independently. Now, to be fair, and this channel is built on fairness, even when it's less satisfying than a clean villain, retaining tissue during an active investigation is not automatically suspicious. Dr. Melinek was direct about this too. Medical examiners' offices do this regularly, sometimes to preserve material for further specialized study, sometimes specifically to hold as evidence if there's any concern the case could eventually go to trial. On its own, the act of retention proves nothing. What it does mean, though, is this: if the state retained that tissue, the state also examined that tissue at some point, and whatever they found from it exists somewhere right now inside the first autopsy report, a report the public still has not seen in full. The retention itself isn't the scandal. The silence surrounding it is. There's a second complication in this case that sounds almost too simple to matter, and it doesn't get nearly enough attention. Toxicology, and specifically blood alcohol. In a case where a body is recovered quickly, a blood alcohol reading is relatively straightforward to interpret. It reflects more or less what was actually in a person's system when they died. But Nolan's body was not recovered quickly. It spent 2 days in the water before it was found, and then it went to a full-state autopsy before Dr. Mitchell ever got his turn with it days later. That gap changes the math on toxicology in a way most viewers have never had explained to them. As a body decomposes, bacteria inside it become active, and those bacteria can produce alcohol on their own, entirely separate from anything the person actually drank while alive. In a body with significant decomposition, that internally generated alcohol can climb high enough to cross a legal intoxication threshold purely through bacterial activity, with zero connection to actual drinking behavior. Dr. Melinek was specific about the range here. A decomposed body can show blood alcohol readings up to roughly 0.2% purely from decomposition, more than double the legal driving limit in most states, without a single drop of alcohol ever having been consumed. That single distinction undercuts one of the earliest and most widely repeated details in this entire case, an early records request that described Nolan's alcohol intake that day as heavy. That word spread across the internet almost immediately, and for a lot of people following this story, it quietly became a kind of shortcut explanation, an easy way to fill in a gap the investigation hadn't actually answered yet. But that description came from a preliminary field note gathered in the early hours of an active search, not from a completed, context-adjusted toxicology report. Once decomposition is factored in the way Dr. Melinek describes, any final number tied to alcohol, in this case, has to be read with real caution, not taken at face value as proof of anything. We're going to pause here for a second, because this is exactly the point in the video where a lot of channels either speed past the nuance or start making claims the evidence doesn't actually support. We're not going to do that. So instead, let's use this moment for something useful. This channel runs on people who actually care about getting a case right, not people chasing the loudest theory in the comment section. If that's you, and if you made it this far into a script this dense without skipping ahead, you are exactly who this channel was built for. Subscribing helps us keep building videos like this one instead of the 12-minute rehash everyone else is putting out. So if you haven't yet, now's the moment. Thank you for sticking with us through the technical part, because the payoff is coming. Let's go back to that discoloration Dr. Mitchell documented at the back of Nolan's head, because this is the second physical finding in this case that keeps getting flattened into something it isn't. During his independent exam, Dr. Mitchell noted an area of discoloration, described in his own language as a reddened area in the deep soft tissue of the occipital region, the back of the head. He was careful, notably careful, in how he characterized it. No fractures were found there, no breaks in the skin above it. He called the cause of that discoloration unclear, and he left it exactly that way in his written findings, without speculating beyond what the tissue itself could actually tell him. Here's where a lot of the public conversation around this case went wrong. That single documented detail, a reddened area with no further characterization, got treated online as though it were confirmed finding of blunt force trauma. It never was. Dr. Kendall Crowns, the chief medical examiner in Tarrant County, Texas, reviewed this exact detail publicly and offered a list of entirely plausible explanations that have nothing to do with an attack at all. It could be hemorrhage from blunt force trauma. Yes. It could also be hyperextension of the neck, the kind of thing that happens if someone falls awkwardly, say, out of a boat. It could be a decompositional change, the natural breakdown of muscular tissue that can produce a similar reddened appearance entirely apart from any injury. Or it could simply be post-mortem lividity, the pooling of blood that happens after death purely due to gravity and body positioning, especially relevant here since Nolan's body would have been lying on its back through recovery, through the first autopsy, through transport to Washington, D.C., and through the second autopsy. Blood doesn't drain out of a body during an autopsy. Some of that pooling would still be visible regardless of what actually happened to Nolan on Horn Island. Dr. Crowns was blunt about the biggest myth circulating around this case, and it's worth repeating word for word because it corrects so much of what spread online in the days after that press conference. No one, not Dr. Mitchell, not any other named forensic professional, has ever said definitively that the reddened area is proof of blunt force trauma. Nobody has made that claim. What actually exists is a documented, unexplained finding, paired with an acknowledgement that the tissue capable of answering the deeper question, whether there's any sign of neck compression specifically, was never available for independent review in the first place. Dr. Crowns also walked through, in detail, exactly what a layered neck dissection actually involves, and it's worth understanding the mechanics here, because it explains why the specific piece of retained anatomy is treated so differently from almost anything else on the body. When a pathologist examines the neck for possible strangulation, they don't simply glance at the skin. They cut back the surface layer and peel back each individual muscle in sequence, looking specifically for internal hemorrhaging that would indicate blunt trauma or sustained compression. They evaluate the thyroid cartilage, the trachea, the larynx, and the hyoid bone for fractures. In a person Nolan's age, Dr. Crowns noted, these structures haven't yet ossified, haven't hardened the way they do later in adulthood, generally starting around the age of 50. That means in a young person, these structures are more rubbery, more flexible, and considerably less likely to fracture even under real pressure, unless that pressure is extreme and sustained. In other words, the absence of a hyoid fracture in a young victim would not, by itself, rule out strangulation the way it might in an older victim. It makes the soft tissue findings, the muscle hemorrhaging, the petechiae, even more important, because the bone itself is a less reliable indicator at Nolan's age. That detail cuts in an important direction that deserves to be said plainly. The retained tissue isn't just marginally relevant to this case. In a victim as young as Nolan, it may be the single most reliable category of physical evidence capable of confirming or ruling out neck trauma at all, because the bony findings pathologists typically rely on in older victims are considerably less dependable here. Dr. Crowns also addressed, directly, why an examiner might choose to retain that tissue in the first place, separate from any accusation of wrongdoing. It's not, he explained, something done on every single autopsy. It's done specifically in cases carrying some degree of suspicion or in cases where the circumstances themselves, a young person found dead in open water after going missing for days with no clear explanation, warrant a closer, more microscopic level of examination than a routine drowning would typically receive. Some offices, he noted, go a step further and bring in a forensic anthropologist specifically to examine those retained neck structures for microfractures too subtle to catch with the naked eye. None of that, on its own, tells us what the state's examiner actually found. It tells us why they might have chosen to look more closely in the first place, and it underscores exactly why an independent pathologist working without that same tissue is operating with a real, acknowledged blind spot. So here's where this leaves us, stated as plainly as the evidence actually allows. There is no confirmed cause of death. There is no confirmed manner of death. There is a documented, unexplained area of discoloration with several equally plausible, innocent explanations attached to it. There is a specific, named piece of anatomy, the front of the neck, that would be capable of confirming or ruling out strangulation, and that piece of anatomy has been retained by the state and never released for independent examination. And there is a toxicology picture so complicated by decomposition that even a completed report may never fully answer whether Nolan had been drinking that day at all. It's also worth being honest about the delays themselves, because they become their own source of public frustration, separate from any of the forensic detail we've covered. The family's independent autopsy findings were originally expected within days of the examination itself. Ben Crump has said those delays stemmed largely from logistical problems, at one point specifically flight cancellations complicating the transport of Nolan's body to Washington, D.C., rather than any issue with the findings themselves. The state's own toxicology results have remained pending as well, held up by ordinary laboratory turnaround times that don't move any faster simply because a case has drawn national attention. Two separate medical processes, in two separate jurisdictions, both stalled at precisely the moment public attention on this case reached its highest point. That timing isn't anyone's fault specifically. Toxicology work takes as long as it takes, whether the person being tested is a private citizen nobody's ever heard of or the center of a story with the attorney who represented George Floyd's family standing beside the parents. But it does mean that every theory currently circulating about this case, including some we've had to correct directly tonight, is being built on top of an incomplete medical record. And that gap between an anxious public and a slow, careful process is exactly where fabricated claims tend to spread fastest. Type the word retain in the comments if you now understand why undetermined isn't the same thing as nothing happened, and isn't the same thing as we already know what happened either. That one word, retained, is doing more work in this case than almost any other detail we've covered tonight, and I want to see how many of you caught it. There's a human dimension to this case that's easy to lose underneath the forensic detail, and it's worth stopping on directly, because it explains a lot of why this family has pursued transparency as aggressively as they have. Under Mississippi law, a crime victim's family is generally entitled to receive an instant report within 72 hours of death. That window came and went for Christine and Elmore Wansley without that report in hand. By their own account, given publicly at a press conference alongside their attorneys, the last direct contact either of them had received from the sheriff's department for well over a week was a single text message, one Christine had sent herself, simply asking for any kind of update on the investigation into her own son's death. That is not a small detail. That is, by any reasonable standard, a real and documented gap in how a grieving family was kept informed during an active, high-profile death investigation. It later came out that part of that silence stemmed from a handoff nobody had actually explained to the family at the time. The district attorney's office had quietly taken over communications, routing everything through a victim advocate, a reasonable administrative decision on its own, but one that left two parents wondering for days why the agency investigating their son's death had apparently gone silent, when in reality, responsibility had simply shifted to a different office without anyone telling them. To her credit, once that gap was raised directly in a meeting with the family, District Attorney Angel Myers McElrath reportedly took accountability for it and committed to better, more consistent communication going forward, with a dedicated victim advocate now assigned specifically to keep the family updated. That's a meaningful correction. It does undo the fact that it took a public press conference, a documented complaint, and sustained pressure from national attorneys to produce a level of basic communication that should have existed automatically, without a family having to fight for it in the first place. Let's talk now about how this case actually got to this point procedurally, because the timeline itself tells you something important about how differently this investigation has been handled compared to how these things typically unfold. Nolan's family did not simply accept the sheriff's early statement and wait quietly for updates. Within days, they retained attorney Ben Crump, a name familiar to anyone who has followed cases where a family believed the official account wasn't a complete account. They arranged the independent autopsy with Dr. Mitchell. They pushed publicly and repeatedly for transparency from local law enforcement, and that pressure appears to have produced real documented movement. Jackson County District Attorney Angel Myers McElrath met directly with the family, confirming that once the Sheriff's Department's investigation concludes, the case will be presented to a grand jury. She was also specific, in a way that deserves real attention, about what that referral does and does not mean. Every unnatural or suspicious death in Jackson County, she's confirmed, gets presented to a grand jury as standard procedure, something her office has apparently done consistently throughout her career. That means a grand jury referral by itself is not evidence that criminal charges are imminent. It is a standard next step for a death like this one, regardless of what the grand jury eventually decides to do with the evidence in front of it. That single piece of context matters enormously, because a lot of coverage of this case has treated the words grand jury as though they're synonymous with murder charges are coming. They are not the same thing, and conflating them does a real disservice to a family that has asked consistently for accuracy rather than headlines. It's worth spending a moment on what a grand jury actually does, because the process itself is unusually opaque, and that opacity is exactly what fuels a lot of the anxiety around this case. Grand jury proceedings are secret by design. There is no media coverage allowed inside the room. Defense attorneys aren't present. Ben Crump, despite representing the family, would not be allowed inside either. It is simply a prosecutor presenting evidence to a panel of ordinary citizens, somewhere between 15 and 25 of them in this jurisdiction, who then decide, based solely on what's placed in front of them, whether there's enough probable cause to issue an indictment. That evidence could point toward a homicide charge. It could just as easily point toward something considerably narrower, obstruction of justice, tampering with evidence, filing a false report, charges that would carry real consequences for whoever they applied to without requiring proof that anyone caused Nolan's death directly. It's also entirely possible the grand jury reviews everything presented to it and declines to indict anyone at all. If that happens, the public may never get a detailed explanation of why, because grand jury deliberations themselves aren't released. That secrecy is a real source of frustration for a family that has already waited months for basic transparency, and is a legitimate thing to be frustrated by, even though it's also procedurally entirely normal. There's also a legitimate difference of opinion among legal observers about how much weight a grand jury referral should carry in the first place. A former Mississippi judge has publicly pointed to a separate, earlier case in the same jurisdiction involving a fatal police shooting, where despite what he's described as overwhelming evidence, a grand jury still failed to produce an indictment, and he's argued that a referral on its own shouldn't automatically be read as meaningful progress. Other attorneys covering this case have pushed back, noting that this referral is simply standard, routine procedure for the specific county regardless of outcome. Both of those positions can be true at once. This can be an entirely routine procedural step, and the specific prosecutor's office can still deserve continued, close public attention as the case moves forward. Holding both of those ideas at the same time, instead of collapsing them into whichever one feels more satisfying, is exactly the kind of discipline this case has demanded from the very beginning. At that same meeting, both sides agreed to something genuinely unusual in a case like this: A mutual inspection of Nolan's cell phone, meaning the family's own forensic experts and law enforcement's experts will examine the device's data at the exact same time, in the same room, seeing the same information the moment it's extracted. This detail arrived only after real, sustained public pressure. Legal analysts covering the case have called a joint, simultaneous forensic inspection like this highly unusual, the kind of concession a state prosecutor's office typically doesn't offer a victim's family, precisely because it exists to solve a specific trust problem. When two separate parties examine the same piece of digital evidence separately, disputes almost always follow over chain of custody, over whether anything was altered along the way, over whose forensic conclusions should actually be believed. Doing the extraction together, in the same room, with everyone watching the same screen at the same time, removes almost all of that risk. Whatever is actually on that phone, both sides will see it in the exact same instant, which matters enormously if this case ever reaches a courtroom and a defense attorney tries to argue that the evidence was somehow compromised before anyone else got access to it. That detail matters because of what's already publicly known about that phone. According to Nolan's mother, when she used a location tracking app to find her son's device after he was reported missing, it turned up not with him, but at the home of one of the friends who'd been with him that day. When she and her sister eventually looked through it, they found that Nolan's Snapchat accounts, an app he reportedly used constantly, had no saved photos or videos from that 4th of July, even though that content should still have been retrievable within the app's usual retention window. That is not, on its own, proof of anything sinister. Apps behave unpredictably. Content gets lost for mundane reasons all the time, but it is exactly the kind of detail that makes a joint, simultaneous forensic inspection a right call, because it removes the possibility of either side later claiming the other altered or selectively presented what was actually on that device. Let's take a short break here, because we're roughly at the halfway mark of everything we need to cover, and this is exactly the moment where most viewers either commit to finishing a video or drift off. If you're still here, you're clearly someone who wants a whole picture instead of the 3-minute version, and honestly, that's rare, and we appreciate it. Our subscriber count still trails our view count by a wide margin on this channel, which tells us a lot of you are watching without joining the community that actually gets first access to updates the moment they break. If today's the day you fix that, hit subscribe now. It genuinely helps more than you think, and it costs you nothing but a click. Thank you for being here. Let's go a layer deeper on the toxicology question, because Dr. Kendall Crowns, the Tarrant County Chief Medical Examiner who reviewed this case publicly, added detail here that most coverage skipped past entirely, and it's some of the most genuinely useful forensic science in this entire story. Toxicology testing typically draws from a handful of sources inside the body: blood, a fluid inside the eyeball called vitreous humor, sometimes gastric contents, sometimes urine, occasionally bile. None of that testing has anything to do with the retained neck structures, Dr. Crowns confirmed directly. So the two issues in this case, the missing tissue and the alcohol question, are entirely separate forensic problems that simply happen to be unresolved at the same time. Standard turnaround for a toxicology report, he explained, runs about 6 to 8 weeks in most jurisdictions. Faster if nothing unusual turns up, slower if something does. And critically, once decomposition enters the picture, there is no clean mathematical formula that lets a pathologist subtract out exactly how much of a given alcohol reading came from actual drinking versus bacterial activity after death. You can't reverse engineer the way you might calculate how quickly a living person metabolizes alcohol over time. Once someone has died, that metabolic process stops entirely. Whatever blood alcohol level existed at the moment of death is a number that would have been accurate then, but decomposition can add to that number afterward, sometimes substantially, and there is no equation capable of cleanly separating the two. What pathologists rely on instead, Dr. Crowns explained, is correlation between the toxicology number and physical findings elsewhere in the body. In cases of genuine heavy, sustained drinking, the liver itself changes, developing a distinctive yellow, fatty appearance instead of its normal reddish-brown color, a finding that can help support or undercut whatever the blood alcohol reading shows. Without that kind of corroborating physical evidence, an elevated alcohol reading in a decomposed body has to be treated with real caution rather than accepted as proof of intoxication on its own. This detail also matters for any other substance that might eventually turn up in Nolan's system. Cocaine, methamphetamine, fentanyl, and similar substances can generally still be detected even in a decomposed body, sometimes preserved specifically in the fluid of blisters that form as decomposition progresses, though the exact levels can shift and become harder to interpret precisely the longer decomposition continues. Dr. Crowns was also asked directly whether this case could realistically end with both a completed cause of death and a manner of death left permanently undetermined. And his answer is worth sitting with, because it reframes what closure might actually look like in this specific case. It's entirely possible, he said, that a final cause of death eventually gets listed as drowning, since Nolan was, after all, recovered from open water, while the manner of death, meaning whether that drowning was accidental or the result of someone else's actions, remains undetermined indefinitely, simply because there may never be enough information available to establish exactly how he ended up in that water in the first place. That is a genuinely uncomfortable possibility for a family desperate for a complete answer, but it is also, according to two entirely separate forensic pathologists working from opposite ends of this exact case, a realistic and honest one. Before we get the audio, there's an earlier piece of misinformation in this case that deserves its own correction because it moved through the internet with the same speed and the same eventual collapse. And understanding how it fell apart teaches you something about how to evaluate everything else in this story. Days after Nolan's body was recovered, a photo began circulating alongside a Facebook post from an account Nolan's mother had never spoken to and had never met. The post claimed that Nolan had actually returned from Horn Island alive, that he'd attended a pool party, that an altercation had broken out, that he'd been beaten, and that his body had then been taken back to the water. The photo accompanying that claim appeared to show Nolan in a pool surrounded by a group of people, and within hours it had reached hundreds of thousands of viewers. Ben Crump himself reposted the image, though his own caption at the time explicitly said he did not know whether the underlying claims were fact or rumor, and that his team was following every clue until the truth was found. For much of the internet, though, that nuance got lost, and the theory hardened into something people treated as settled. It wasn't. Photo metadata, obtained independently and corroborated through a second source by Rolling Stone, showed the image had actually been taken on June 27th, 8 full days before the 4th of July, at a separate gathering in Pass Christian, Mississippi, before Nolan had ever boarded a boat to Horn Island at all. Trayston Shepard, the same friend who would later step forward on an audio question, confirmed the date and identified the people in the photo himself, including Nolan. He hadn't attended that particular party. He said he'd been working and had church the next morning, but he knew exactly who was there and when. The photo had simply been uploaded on July 5th as part of an ordinary catch-up post of recent memories, and uploaded is not the same thing as taken. Once that distinction became clear, the entire theory collapsed. Shepard's own reaction to watching a real photo of his friend get twisted into fabricated proof of a beating that never happened was blunt. He called it unbelievable and heartbreaking. We're walking you through that correction in full, not because it's still an active theory anyone credible is pushing, but because it is the clearest possible example of exactly how quickly a case like this one can get pulled away from the actual evidence, and exactly how much responsibility a channel covering has to slow down and check a claim before repeating it. Every single detail we bring you tonight has gone through that same check. That's the whole point of doing this differently than the version of the story that spread first. Now, let's turn to the second major piece of disputed evidence, the piece that's dominated an even larger share of the public conversation around this case, and that we need to address just as directly, because getting it wrong in either direction, dismissing it entirely or treating it as settled fact, would be a disservice to Nolan and to you. In the days after Nolan's body was recovered, a piece of audio began circulating widely online. It came from a call made to a private towing company, not to 911 directly, in which a young man's voice could be heard reporting that a boat's bilge pump had failed and that water was coming in. In the background of that call, underneath overlapping voices and static, some listeners believe they can make out an argument, specifically a voice that seemed to be demanding, "Give me my freaking phone. What are you freaking doing?" For a period of time, Ben Crump himself referenced this audio publicly, saying he believed the voice belonged to Nolan. Since then, that claim has been directly disputed by someone who says he was actually the person speaking in that recording. Trayston Shepard, described by Nolan's own family as one of his closest friends, came forward to multiple outlets, including ABC News, to say plainly that the yelling captured in that clip is his own voice, not Nolan's, and that it stemmed from a completely separate altercation he'd had with someone else on the island that day, unrelated to Nolan entirely. Crump himself has since acknowledged the confusion publicly, stating that the original claim came from what one witness told his team, that a second witness has since come forward disputing it, and that going forward, his team intends to be more careful about labeling information as what a specific witness said rather than presenting it as confirmed fact. That correction matters, and it's worth sitting with for a second, because it's exactly the kind of moment that separates careful reporting on a case like this from the kind of coverage that just chases whatever detail is generating the most views. A claim that had already traveled across the entire internet, repeated in comment sections, screenshotted, argued over as though it were confirmed evidence, turned out to be, at minimum, seriously disputed and possibly entirely unrelated to Nolan. There's a further wrinkle here worth knowing, because it's the kind of detail that almost never makes it into viral coverage. A digital forensics expert who appeared on national television did something that, as far as we can tell, almost nobody else covering this case had done. He obtained the original recording as first released through an official public records request and placed it directly against a version that had gone viral online after being run through audio enhancement software. What he found was not a small discrepancy. The enhanced version that spread across social media ran a full 20 seconds longer than the original file, and the two recordings carried entirely different digital signatures, meaning the version most people actually heard had been altered from its source in a way that separates it meaningfully from the original evidence. That expert said plainly that he could not corroborate a single one of the specific phrases people online believed they'd made out in that recording. Not the name some claimed to hear, not the disputed sentence about a phone. None of it held up once measured against a genuine, unaltered original. He also pointed out something that went almost entirely unreported at the time. The version of the recording released by Mississippi Marine authorities had already been partially redacted before the public ever heard it, with certain identifying details stripped out for privacy reasons. Which means a truly untouched, completely original recording, the one that existed before any redaction and before any enhancement, has still, as of this recording, never actually been made public by anyone at all. We want to be as careful here as that expert was, because this is precisely the kind of claim this channel exists to slow down rather than amplify. So let's be direct about where the specific thread of the case currently stands. A claim has circulated that federal investigators have privately identified whose voice is actually on that recording. As of this recording, that claim has not been confirmed by the FBI, has not been confirmed by the Jackson County Sheriff's Office, and is not supported by any named on-record law enforcement source. We are telling you this exists because it's part of the public conversation around this case, and pretending it doesn't exist would leave gaps in your understanding of why this story keeps evolving the way it does. But we are not going to present it to you as settled, because it isn't, and a channel that cares about accuracy has to hold that line even when a juicier version of the story is sitting right there. Type the word unverified in the comments if you want more of this exact kind of separation. Claims clearly labeled against confirmed fact, instead of the blended version most coverage of this case gives you. That word matters because it's the discipline this entire investigation still needs from all of us watching unfold. Let's turn now to the other central contradiction in this case, the one involving the final hour anyone can actually account for in Nolan's day. According to the account given consistently by several of Nolan's friends, he chose to stay behind on Horn Island rather than return with the group when their boat developed engine trouble, planning to catch a later ride, possibly with a young woman named Katie he'd spent part of the afternoon with. According to an account relayed by Katie's own family, specifically her sister, Gracie McCormick, in public statements. Katie's understanding from her conversation with Nolan was that he intended to head back and rejoin the boat he'd originally arrived on, not that he was planning to stay behind with her. Ben Crump has publicly framed this as a direct, irreconcilable contradiction. One account says Nolan stayed, the other says he was leaving. Someone, in Crump's framing, isn't telling the truth. It's worth handling this contradiction with more precision than a simple "someone is lying," because that framing, while understandable given how emotionally direct this case is for Nolan's family, may actually oversimplify what happened. Katie's own account, relayed by her family, is explicitly built on inference, not a direct observation. Her family has said, in their own words, that she assumed Nolan was heading back to the boat based on their conversation. She did not, according to that same account, actually watch him get on it. She left the island separately, on a different boat entirely, with her brother and his fiancée. That means her account tells us what Nolan said he intended to do. It does not tell us what he actually did in the minutes after that conversation ended, or whether anything changed his plan in that window. Gracie McCormick's own public statement is worth quoting closely, because the specific word she chose is doing real work. She said Katie assumed Nolan was getting ready to get on the boat he'd originally come out on, and that Katie further assumed the friends telling him to get on wouldn't have left without him. That word, assumed, appears twice in a single account, and it's the family's own careful acknowledgement that what they're offering is a reasonable inference drawn from a real conversation, not a direct, eyewitness account of what actually happened once that conversation ended. Katie herself, according to her family, was on the island that day with a separate group of friends entirely, and left later with her brother and his fiancée, on a different boat altogether, meaning that whatever unfolded after her conversation with Nolan concluded, she simply wasn't present to see it. That distinction matters enormously, because it means both accounts. The friends say he chose to stay, and Katie's family saying he intended to leave, could theoretically both reflect honest memories of the same afternoon, if something shifted in the gap between the stated intention and whatever happened next. That gap, the specific stretch of time after Nolan's last confirmed conversation, and before he ended up in the water, remains the single most important unanswered question in this entire investigation. Despite Horn Island reportedly being packed with well over 200 people that day, boats everywhere, families everywhere, no verified independent witness has ever come forward to confirm exactly what Nolan did in that window or exactly how he ended up in the water. That absence of clear eyewitness is precisely why investigators have repeatedly, publicly asked anyone who was on Horn Island that day to come forward with any photos, video, or first-hand account they might have. This is also the exact point in the story where we have to be careful about something the project's standard we hold ourselves to demands. None of Nolan's friends who were with him that day have been charged with any crime. None of them have been named by law enforcement as suspects. What exists right now, publicly, is a set of witness accounts that don't fully align, alongside a family's understandable frustration that communication from local law enforcement has, at points, been sparse. Nolan's mother has said the last direct contact she had from the sheriff's department for over a week was a single text message, one she sent herself, simply asking for an update that is a real, documented gap in communication. It is not, on its own, evidence of a cover-up. Holding both of those truths at once, a real communication failure, and the absence of confirmed wrongdoing by any specific named individual, is exactly the kind of discipline this case demands from anyone covering it honestly. There's one more piece of context worth adding here about Trayston Shepard specifically, because it speaks directly to how much weight his account should reasonably carry. In a separate interview, Shepard volunteered on the record that the friend group had been drinking since late morning that day, after several boats had already arrived on Horn Island. That is not a small admission for someone in his position to make publicly. He also said plainly that he's waiting for the actual facts before forming any further opinions of his own, that if it turns out someone harmed Nolan, he hopes justice follows, and that if it turns out to be a tragic accident where somebody simply didn't speak up in time, he hopes justice follows there too. I just know I've lost my best friend, he said. He had already put his own name on the line once, correcting the record on the disputed audio at real personal risk, given that he and his friends have reportedly received death threats over this case. He could have used that same platform to defend the friend group more forcefully, or to insist the whole story had been blown out of proportion, and simply waited for public attention to move on. Instead, he left the door open publicly to either outcome, with his own name attached to it, and volunteered a detail as simple and as potentially damaging as a full day of drinking on the record, when nothing required him to say it all. Whatever else is true about that day, that is a harder thing to do than staying quiet would have been, and it's worth giving him credit for it, even while continuing to ask hard questions about everyone who was present on that island. We're now past the point in this video where most channels would have wrapped things up with a dramatic, unsupported conclusion. We're not going to do that, because Nola deserves a story built on what's actually known, not what generates the most outrage. If that's the kind of coverage you want more of, and if you've made it this far, you clearly do, this is a good moment to subscribe. We're building a community around getting cases like this one right, patiently, and that only works if the people who value that patience actually stick around for it. Thank you for being one of them. Let's talk now about where the investigation stands institutionally, because there's real, confirmed movement here that deserves attention separate from any of the more speculative threads we've covered. The FBI has been involved in this case in an advisory capacity, in part because Horn Island sits on federal land within the Gulf Islands National Seashore, and in part specifically to address threats made against people connected to the investigation, since multiple witnesses, including Trayston Shepard, have publicly said they've received death threats simply for speaking to media outlets and correcting the record on disputed claims. Jackson County Sheriff John Ledbetter has confirmed his office remains a lead agency and has said in more recent statements that the investigation is active and ongoing, a notably more cautious framing than his initial statement in the first days after Nolan's body was recovered. That shift in tone matters on its own, independent of anything else in this case. It is, at minimum, an acknowledgement that the version of events this office was comfortable stating out loud in the first hours after Nolan's body was found is not the same version it's comfortable stating now, weeks later, with 60 witness interviews behind it and a grand jury referral in front of it. Sheriff Ledbetter has also credited the public directly for real, tangible progress in this case, saying his office has received a steady stream of tips and information from ordinary people who were on Horn Island that day or who know someone who was. Information his department is actively working through as part of the broader effort to fill in exactly the kind of gap we spent this entire video walking through. Roughly 60 witnesses have been formally interviewed as investigators work to reconstruct the timeline of that day, a number that reflects an investigation that has expanded well past the immediate friend group and into strangers, boaters, and anyone else who might have been present on the island. That number deserves real attention on its own. It means whatever picture eventually emerges from this investigation won't rest on the account of a handful of teenagers who were physically closest to Nolan that afternoon. It will be built from dozens of separate, independent perspectives, compared against each other, and measured against the physical evidence, the GPS data, and forensic findings that continue to develop in parallel. That kind of breadth takes real time to work through properly, and it's a meaningful part of why a case this publicly urgent can still legitimately take months to resolve, even with every legal team involved working as quickly as the evidence allows them to. The NAACP has formally passed a resolution calling on local, state, and federal authorities, including the Department of Justice, to conduct a complete and transparent review of Nolan's death. A reward for information leading to an arrest and conviction has grown to $125,000, funded jointly by Reverend Al Sharpton, filmmaker Tyler Perry, and former NFL player Terrell Owens. Reverend Sharpton has been careful, at least in his public statements, to frame the family's position specifically. They are not, in his words, bringing race into this, but they are not discounting it either. That is a meaningful distinction, and it's worth understanding exactly what it means. It is the difference between demanding accountability and demanding a predetermined conclusion, and it reflects a family that has said, consistently and directly, that all they are asking for is the same thorough, transparent investigation any family would want after losing a child this suddenly. Before we go further, let's take one more moment to check in, because we're deep into a case that requires patience most channels don't ask of their viewers. If you made it this far, you're not here for a quick dopamine hit off a scandalous headline. You're here because you actually want to understand what happened to an 18-year-old kid. And that's exactly the kind of viewer this channel is trying to build a community around. We keep saying it because it keeps being true. Our view counts on cases like this one are strong. But our subscriber numbers lag noticeably behind them. And that gap means a lot of you watching right now won't be notified the moment the next real update in this case drops. The toxicology report, the phone inspection results, the grand jury's next move. If you want to actually be part of this instead of stumbling back into it later, subscribe now, and let's keep going together. There's also a broader question sitting underneath this entire case that deserves to be named directly rather than tiptoed around, because Nolan's family themselves have raised it publicly, carefully, and without demanding a predetermined answer. It's a question of whether a young black man, reportedly the only black teenager in a large friend group on that island that day, would have received a different, faster, more thorough initial response if the circumstances had looked different. That's not an accusation this channel is making about any specific named individual. It's a pattern that shows up across a long, documented history of cases where initial law enforcement statements moved faster than the evidence justified, and where families were left to build their own parallel investigations simply to get the same baseline transparency other families receive automatically. Reverend Al Sharpton's own framing of this, that the family isn't bringing race into the case but isn't discounting it either, captures that tension about as precisely as language allows. It's possible for this case to ultimately resolve as an accident with nothing sinister behind it, and for the pattern of how it was initially handled to still deserve scrutiny. Those two things are not in conflict with each other. Now here's where we bring together everything we've covered tonight, because a former FBI agent, Jennifer Coffin-Daffer, reviewing the same public record the rest of us have access to, arrived at a conclusion worth sitting with precisely because of how carefully hedged it is. Based on the surveillance footage, the witness accounts, the Coast Guard communications, and the well-documented dangerous current around Horn Island, she said that what's publicly known on its face looks like an accident. And in the same breath, she said something that should stop anyone from treating that as a closed case. She does not believe the public record, as it currently exists, is the complete truth. Both of those statements can be true simultaneously, and holding them together, rather than collapsing them into a simpler, more satisfying single conclusion, is exactly the discipline this case demands right now. It means the evidence currently available leans toward an accident. It also means a trained former investigator, with no stake in this case's outcome, does not believe the public has been given the full picture yet. That is not a contradiction. That is what honest uncertainty actually sounds like, and it is a much harder position to sit in than picking a side and defending it. Before we lay out those three possibilities, we need to pause on a word that gets thrown around loosely in cases exactly like this one, because the differences inside that word matter enormously, both legally and morally. Cover up. That single word can mean wildly different things depending on how it's used. And collapsing all of them into one maximally alarming category does real damage to how fairly a case like this gets understood. It could mean something relatively minor. A group of scared teenagers hiding the fact that they'd been drinking underage, or feeling embarrassed about some unrelated detail that had nothing whatsoever to do with how Nolan actually died, and simply choosing not to volunteer it. It could mean something more serious, deliberately deleting messages, or giving investigators a misleading account of the timeline specifically to avoid scrutiny, without that concealment being connected in any way to how Nolan was actually harmed. Or, in its most serious possible form, it could mean actively concealing direct knowledge of how Nolan came to be hurt. Those are three entirely different categories of behavior, carrying three entirely different levels of legal and moral culpability. And this case, as it currently stands, has not been shown to definitively land in any one of them specifically. A teenager who deleted a single photo out of simple embarrassment over underage drinking is not remotely equivalent to someone who deliberately concealed evidence of how a friend actually died. Both could technically be described using the same three-word phrase: Only one of them represents anything close to the kind of serious wrongdoing that the most alarming corners of this case's coverage have implied. And holding that distinction clearly in mind is essential to understanding everything that follows. It's worth understanding exactly what makes an assessment like Coffin Daffer's different from the vast majority of commentary this case has generated online. She isn't connected to this investigation in any official capacity. She isn't building a theory around a single viral clip or a disputed piece of audio. She's a trained former investigator working from the same public record everyone else watching this video has access to, applying professional judgment specifically to distinguish between details that genuinely support conclusion and details that simply sound suspicious, without actually pointing anywhere concrete. That distinction matters enormously in a case that has already generated as much competing, unverified content as this one has. And it's exactly the kind of discipline this channel has tried to model for you across every section of this video. Institutional pressure on this case has also continued building in ways separate from any of the three possibilities themselves. And it's worth naming plainly, because it shapes the degree of scrutiny this investigation is now operating under. The NAACP has formally passed a resolution calling on local, state, and federal authorities, including the Department of Justice, to conduct a complete, transparent review of what happened to Nolan. The reward for information leading to an arrest and conviction has grown to $125,000, funded jointly by Reverend Al Sharpton, Tyler Perry, and former NFL player Terrell Owens. None of that pressure, on its own, moves this case toward any one of the three possibilities we've laid out tonight. But it does mean that whatever evidence eventually resolves this case will do so under an unusually intense degree of national scrutiny, a level of attention most single, contested deaths never come close to receiving. And that scrutiny itself becomes part of the story now, whether or not it changes the underlying facts. There are, realistically, three shapes this case could ultimately take, and it's worth naming all three plainly rather than pretending only one of them is possible. The first is the simplest and, statistically, the most common explanation for a case shaped like this one. A genuine accidental drowning on a barrier island with currents documented repeatedly by people who know that water well, as capable of shifting from a few feet deep to 20 feet within a couple of steps. No gradual slope, no visible warning. Just sand that drops away beneath the person's feet in an instant. On a crowded holiday beach, with more than 200 people scattered across the sand and dozens of boats anchored offshore, a drowning can happen quickly and almost silently, because real drownings, unlike what film and television depict, rarely involve visible struggling, waving, or calling out for help at all. The human body, in the final moments before drowning, prioritizes the basic mechanics of trying to breathe over almost any other voluntary movement, which means a person drowning can look, from even a short distance away, almost unremarkable right up until it's too late for anyone nearby to realize what they're actually watching. Applied specifically to a beach reportedly packed with strangers, none of them individually responsible for keeping an eye on any one person in particular, that dynamic becomes considerably easier to imagine than it might first sound. Under this version of events, everything that's followed, the missing phone content, the inconsistent timeline details, reflects nothing more than scared teenagers handling a tragedy badly in its aftermath, not causing one in the moment itself. The second possibility is a middle ground, an accidental death, but one followed by panic, and specifically, some degree of concealment afterward, not to hide a crime against Nolan, but to hide unrelated details, underage drinking, fear of blame, fear of public backlash, that led someone to delete content, give an incomplete account, or hold on to a phone longer than they should have. This is not a hypothetical scenario invented for this case. It mirrors, almost exactly, a separate and completely unrelated case out of Texas involving a young man named Daniel Irving, where two people were criminally charged not for causing their friend's drowning, but specifically for what they did afterward, discarding his phone, deleting messages once they realized an investigation was coming. If something similar occurred here, it would not require revisiting how Nolan actually died. It would only require confirming whether specific actions were taken afterward to obscure details unrelated to the death itself. The third possibility is the most serious, and it is also, as of tonight, the least supported by anything currently confirmed. That some kind of altercation or intervening event contributed directly to Nolan's death, and that accounts since then have been shaped to obscure it. The unexplained discoloration Dr. Mitchell documented, combined with the retained neck tissue that a second examination couldn't rule anything out with, keeps this door technically open. But it is critical to say plainly, because this channel does not deal in unsupported accusations against uncharged individuals. No physical evidence currently confirms this scenario. No witness has directly described a happening. It survives as a possibility specifically because the investigation has not yet produced enough information to close that door, not because anything currently actively points toward it. It's worth being fair, though, about exactly why this third possibility has held on as long as it has in the public conversation, even without a single piece of confirming physical evidence behind it. Dr. Mitchell's own written report doesn't simply say undetermined and stop there. It explicitly states that intervening non-natural factors cannot be ruled out, language that, while carefully hedged, is meaningfully different from what an ordinary, uncomplicated drowning ruling would normally read like. The retained neck structures, even accounting for every plausible innocent explanation Dr. Crowns walked us through, still mean the second, independent exam simply couldn't fully close the door on neck trauma using its own findings alone. And the broader context surrounding this specific case, a young black man, a predominantly white friend group, a state with documented history that this family has referenced directly and publicly, gives this possibility a weight that goes beyond the forensic evidence by itself. None of that confirms the third scenario happened. It does explain, honestly, why it hasn't been dismissed either, and pretending otherwise would be its own kind of dishonesty. Here's a detail that keeps every one of these three possibilities alive at once, and it deserves to be stated as clearly as anything else in this video. Nolan was last confirmed seen around 3 that afternoon, talking with Katie. After that point, no single verified, independent witness account has been able to confirm exactly what he did next, minute by minute, before he ended up in the water. That's not automatically suspicious on its own. Horn Island was reportedly packed that day. Dozens of boats, hundreds of people, a constantly shifting crowd of strangers and loose acquaintances. In an environment like that, it's entirely plausible to lose track of one specific person for a stretch of time without anyone doing anything wrong at all. But it also means the single most important window in this entire case, the actual transition from being seen safely on a crowded beach to ending up in dangerous water, currently has no confirmed independent eyewitness account attached to it whatsoever. Every other detail in this case, the phone, the timeline disputes, the friend group's account measured against Katie's account, exists specifically because that central gap has never been filled. A crime analyst reviewing this case on national television raised exactly this point directly, calling it genuinely striking that nobody in a crowd that size, on an island that packed, has come forward with a clear account of seeing Nolan in the water at all. Investigators, according to that same reporting, are still combing through footage submitted by ordinary people who happened to be on the island that day and may have unknowingly captured Nolan on camera, without realizing at the time. That effort is directly tied to filling this exact gap, and it's part why the sheriff's office has repeatedly, publicly asked anyone who was on Horn Island that day to come forward with any photos or video they might still have sitting on their phone. There's also a specific, testable piece of evidence sitting in front of investigators right now that applies to all three of these possibilities equally, and it's worth understanding why it matters so much. The friend group gave their account of that day to family members and, eventually, to investigators before the boat's GPS tracking data had ever become public. That timing matters enormously, because it means their story was told without any of them knowing exactly what the objective, time-stamped record would eventually show. If their account lines up closely with what that GPS data actually confirms, it becomes real, meaningful corroboration for whichever version of events they've described. If it doesn't line up, if there are gaps or inconsistencies between what they said happened and what the boat's own track movements show, that discrepancy becomes some of the strongest evidence in the entire case, regardless of which of the three possibilities it ultimately points toward. As of this recording, no public reporting has identified a confirmed, meaningful mismatch between the friend group's account and the GPS data. That doesn't rule any of the three possibilities out. It simply means a specific test hasn't yet produced a clear public answer in either direction, and it's one of the details worth watching most closely as this case continues to develop. Type the word gap in the comments if you understand that this entire case right now, at this exact moment, comes down to that one specific unanswered stretch of time between Nolan's last confirmed conversation and the moment he ended up in the water. Every other detail in this story, the phone, the audio, the discoloration, the retained tissue, exists specifically because that gap has never been filled. Filling it is the actual job left in front of investigators. And it's worth remembering that as you read every future update in this case. Let's bring this back one more time to where it needs to end, with Nolan himself and with a family who has spent months fighting for a level of thoroughness that should never have needed to be fought for in the first place. Christine Wansley has said, in her own words, that not knowing is what's killing her, that every morning begins with the same impossible question her family has carried since the 4th of July. She has continued to speak publicly, to plan her son's funeral in front of cameras rather than retreating into private grief, because she wants the world watching, not because she's hiding anything, but because she believes attention is the only thing standing between her son's case and quiet neglect. She has asked consistently for exactly one thing: the truth delivered honestly, whatever it turns out to be, rather than conclusion handed down before the evidence existed to support it. There's one more thread of this case that has to be named directly, because it says something troubling about the environment this family has been forced to grieve inside of as this case grew. So did the volume of fabricated content attached to it. Witnesses who came forward publicly to correct the record, Trace and Shepard among them, have said openly that they and others in their friend group began receiving death threats simply for speaking to reporters and clarifying disputed details. Separately, and more disturbingly, AI-generated videos falsely depicting Christine Wansley have circulated online. Fabricated footage of a grieving mother, manufactured for engagement, spreading at the exact moment she was trying to plan her son's funeral. Ben Crump addressed this directly and plainly. Nobody's life should be threatened in the pursuit of the truth, and nobody should be presumed guilty before actual evidence exists. That standard applies to every single name that has ever been floated in connection with this case, on every side of it. And it's worth remembering the next time a clip claiming to be definitive proof of something in this case shows up in your own feed. Ask where it actually came from before you believe it. Ask again before you share it. This specific case already has documented proof that fabricated content is circulating, and that it has already gotten real people threatened over things they never did. Against that backdrop, Christine Wansley made a choice that says something about the kind of mother she is. On July 20th, the family gathered at Centerpoint Church in Ocean Springs of Nolan's homegoing service, followed by what Christine specifically chose to call a celebration of life at the Jackson County Fairgrounds, rather than traditional, private repast. He would not want us sitting around crying. She said he would want a party. Tyler Perry covered the funeral costs in full. Colin Kaepernick had already funded the independent Autopsy. Reverend Al Sharpton officiated at the family's request. And notably, deliberately, Christine opened that service to media, to cameras, to the exact kind of public attention most grieving families instinctively try to shut out. That choice matters. A mother who still doesn't have her son's official cause of death does not typically invite the world's cameras into his funeral, unless she has concluded that the world attention is the only thing standing between her son's case and quiet neglect. She let the cameras in on purpose. And it's worth sitting with what that decision actually tells you about where this family believes the real danger in this case lies. That is not an unreasonable request. It is, in fact, the most basic thing forensic science is supposed to guarantee any family. And right now, the single biggest obstacle standing between this family and that guarantee is not a lack of expertise, not a lack of effort from the two pathologists who've already examined Nolan's body, but a jar of preserved tissue sitting inside a state office, retained rather than released, holding the one answer capable of finally closing the gap between undetermined and the truth, it's worth stepping back for a moment and asking a broader question, one that extends past a specific case and applies to almost every story this channel covers. Why does a human instinct, when a case like this one produces this much uncertainty, push so hard toward picking a side, calling an accident or calling a cover-up, and then defending that choice as though it were already proven? Genuine uncertainty doesn't resolve itself just because picking a side feels more emotionally satisfying than sitting with ambiguity. The actual work of resolving a case like this happens slowly, through witness interviews, through forensic examination, through the patient accumulation of verified fact, not through confident declarations made before that work is finished. A former FBI agent's own assessment in this case, an accident probably, but I don't fully trust that we have the whole story, is uncomfortable precisely because it refuses that easier, more satisfying resolution. It is also, as of tonight, the most honest place this case can actually stand, and it's a harder position to hold than most viewers are used to being asked to hold. This case also sits inside a wider pattern this channel has tracked across other stories from the same general window of time, cases that, on the surface, look entirely unrelated but that share a common thread worth naming. A missing 4-year-old girl in South Carolina, whose parents' own confessions eventually described 45 days of abuse before anyone called for help, while neighbors who noticed something wrong were left holding pieces of a puzzle no official system connected in time. A young man in Texas, a trained competitive swimmer, whose accidental drowning ruling still left 2 people facing felony charges specifically for what they did in the hours after his death, not for causing it. A private investigator's basic, unglamorous instinct that when a searcher's visible footprint on the ground appears to shrink, the quieter half of an investigation is often only just getting started. Every one of these cases, in its own way, comes back to the same underlying lesson. The version of events that spreads first online is rarely the version that survives contact with actual evidence. And the families left waiting in the middle of that gap deserve patience and rigor far more than they deserve a fast, satisfying headline. None of that similarity means Nolan's case will resolve the same way any of those other cases did. It means the discipline required to cover any of them honestly is exactly the same discipline we've tried to hold to for the last several minutes. Separate what's infirmed from what alleged, name every gap plainly, and resist the urge to hand you a tidy ending this case simply hasn't earned yet. If everything we've walked through tonight, the retained tissue, the disputed audio, the GPS data, the toxicology science, actually change how you understand this case, compared to when you click play, that is exactly the standard this channel exists to meet, video after video, case after case. And it only works long-term if the people who value that kind of coverage actually stick around for it instead of finding us once and moving on. So here's the last ask of this video, and we mean it as sincerely as we've meant every fact we've walked you through tonight. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and be here the moment the next real, confirmed development in this case breaks, whether that's the release of the first autopsy report, independent access to that retained tissue, or the completed, decomposition-adjusted toxicology, results everyone is still waiting on. Our subscriber count still trails our view count by a wide margin on nearly every case we cover, and closing that gap is genuinely the only thing that lets us keep making videos like this one instead of the rushed, 6-minute version everyone else puts out. Thank you, sincerely, for spending this much time with Nolan's story tonight. We don't have the ending of the story yet. Nobody does, not the family, not either legal team, not any of the experts we've drawn from tonight. What we do know precisely is what will take to get there. The release of full first autopsy report, independent access to that retained neck tissue, and a properly interpreted decomposition-adjusted toxicology result. None of that requires speculation. It requires release and access, and nothing more than that. If this video gave you a clearer, more honest picture of this case than what's floating around the rest of the internet right now, that's exactly the standard we hold ourselves on this channel. And it's exactly why we need more of you actually join the community instead of just passing through. Our numbers tell the same story every single video. A lot of views, far fewer subscribers. And that gap means a lot of you are missing updates the moment they actually break. If today is finally the day you close that gap, Hit subscribe now. Turn on notifications, and you'll be here the moment that retained tissue, or that first autopsy report, or that toxicology result finally becomes public. We will break it down exactly the way we broke this down tonight. Fact by fact, without spin, and without pretending to know more than the evidence actually allows. Nolan Xavier Wells was 18 years old. He cooked his mother dinner the night before he left. He hugged her, told her he loved her, and walked out the door into what should have been an ordinary holiday weekend with friends. He was the kind of kid who never met a stranger, the kind of teammate coaches remember by name years later, the kind of son who asked for one more picture before bed simply because the night had been a good one. None of that is a footnote to this case. It is the actual center of it. The reason any of the forensic detail we've walked through tonight matters at all. Right now, the single most important piece of evidence in the case of how he died is sitting in a jar, preserved, unexamined by anyone outside one state office, waiting for someone with the authority to finally release it. Until that happens, until the full first autopsy report sees daylight, until an independent expert gets the access this case has always required, undetermined is not a resolution. It is a placeholder for a truth that already exists somewhere, recorded, documented, simply not yet shared with the people who have earned the right to see it more than anyone else alive. His mother, his father, and the two pathologists who have already given this case more careful, honest attention than the loudest corners of the internet ever have. We will keep following this case exactly the way we've covered it tonight. Fact by fact, source by source, correction by correction. When a claim doesn't hold up, for as long as it takes to get Nolan's family an answer they can actually stand behind. That means when the first autopsy report is finally released in full, we'll walk through it the same way we walked through Dr. Mitchell's findings tonight, line by line, without skipping past the technical language, just because it's harder to summarize in 15 seconds. That means when the toxicology results finally clear the lab, we'll explain exactly what they can and cannot tell us, the same way Dr. Melinek and Dr. Crowns explained it to us. And it means that if the retained neck tissue is ever finally released for independent examination, we will not treat whatever it shows as a foregone conclusion in either direction, because this case, more than almost any other we've covered, has taught us exactly why that kind of restraint matters. If that's the kind of coverage you want waiting for you the next time this case moves, make sure you're subscribed before you go, because we have no way of knowing exactly when that next document, that next report, that next confirmed detail is going to surface. Only that when it does, we'll be here. Rest easy, Nolan. We're not done asking.